Hello again and welcome to the Warhammer 40k Mordian Glory video, and today guys we will be taking a look at the good, the bad and the ugly of the new terrain rules which have been shown to us by Warhammer 40k community as part of the 9th edition reveal / preview. Now I will say overall that I am pretty positive about the terrain rules, although there is a couple that I think could do with some clarification at the very least. And I'm sure a lot of you will have seen some of the excitement that has been generated around the obscuring rule. So we're going to go through all that in this video. Now, I will caveat it by saying this is based on the 9th edition preview. So if you come across this video in the future and it doesn't quite make sense anymore, some of the criticisms that I have may no longer be valid. So just be aware of that. So to help me explain some of the new terrain rules and get across some of the positives and negatives I've got with them, I've set up a typical 40k battlefield here. Now what I've done is I've got the codexes on this side, along the top and down this side, to actually bring the table to the new minimum board size. Slightly off topic, I would say this is the first time I've done this, and it is a noticeable difference. The battlefield does feel significantly smaller. Not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm just saying as this is the first time I've done it, my first impressions are the battlefield does feel smaller. Definitely when I was putting the terrain down I haven't had to quite use as much, and the terrain does feel a little bit denser as well. Now Games Workshop has revealed that they're going to group terrain into 4 different categories: hills, obstacles, area terrain and buildings. On top of that, these categories of terrain will have certain sort of terrain traits assigned to them. So you might have a building or a ruin, for example, which has the terrain trait scalable, breachable, light cover, defensible and obscuring. Now, we don't know what all these terrain traits are yet. Some of them people are already jumping to conclusions, some of them are being assumed. But we do have, Games Workshop has provided us with some examples. So we know what the light cover, the heavy cover, and the obscuring trait does. And we can take a little guess at what some of the other ones are, like scalable, breachable, and defensible, which we'll be doing that today. But don't worry, I'll make sure you know which of the ones we know for certain and which are the ones that we are assuming and taking a bit of a leap at. Now, Games Workshop has made it very clear that it is important to define with your opponent what each piece of terrain is. They have also given some examples and some sort of set pieces. So, like I said before, ruins come with the terrain category area terrain, and they come with 5 or 6 terrain traits. So you can just say to your opponent, rather than having to, at the beginning of each battle, say this particular bit has these 4 or 5 traits, you just say, that is a ruin, and by the rule book it will have the traits automatically assigned to it and the terrain category. So it's good and bad, because on the one hand you might have a bit of terrain which is a bit obscure, which you're going to have to define with your opponent each battle, and you might also have some terrain but it's good because it means if you're using sort of set Games Workshop terrain, you can say, right, this is all ruins, and your opponent will know exactly what traits are assigned to that. So there are good and bad things about it. One other negative that I would point out is that whilst Games Workshop is going to provide traits and categories for their sort of set terrain, the Games Workshop terrain that they sell, for third-party terrain, it's going to get a little bit more tricky, and you are going to have to actually define that. Now, obviously, if you're playing with your mate on your sort of basement battle mat, then it's not going to be a problem. You're going to be able to work out fairly quickly what each bit of terrain is, and you're going to use that time and time again. No worries. However, when it comes to tournaments, you might find that if the tournament organizer doesn't define what the terrain is in the mission pack and the rules pack for each mission, then you could have players who are arguing over the terrain rules before the games even start, and that could waste time. So it's going to be really important for tournament organizers when they're doing the mission pack to include the battlefield terrain on the mission pack map, and to also define what each piece of terrain is on that mission pack. Otherwise, I guarantee there's going to be plenty of tournament players out there who want to get every competitive edge. Nothing wrong with that, but they are going to argue about what bit of terrain is what. So, one person might be running, if we use the battlefield we've got now, one person might say, this is obscuring because they've got a melee army and they want to use it to get up close and personal. And the other person who might have a shooting army might be like, no, it's not obscuring, and they're just going to argue over it. So it's going to be very important for tournament organisers to define what the terrain is in the missions, because otherwise you are going to get arguments between players. So now let's get into the specific examples which Games Workshop has provided as part of their article. So they have defined hills and obstacles. So hills are essentially a part of the battlefield for all intents and purposes, so are treated as open ground and offer no form of protection. Now I know some people are a bit funny about this because, you know, if in real life, if you are behind a hill, a lot of your body is obscured, especially if you're just shooting over the top of it, shooting down. However, what you have to understand in the context of 40k battlefields, most of the time hills aren't really these sort of big hills and mountains. They're actually just small mounds and undulations in the terrain. So it makes sense that they've just said, look, hills are just in our battlefields are just there to represent a bit of uneven ground, but it's not big enough to get its own set of rules. Fair enough. I understand that in the context of the game, and I agree with it. Then you have obstacles. Now, obstacles are an interesting one. Games Workshop says, obstacles, on the other hand, are a footslogger's best friend, as they offer the benefit of cover, which for the most part means +1 to your saving throws against ranged weapons, to infantry, beasts, or swarm units if the obstacle is in the way of the firing unit. Now, a couple of key changes here from 8th edition. Obstacles have now been defined as only giving cover to essentially small models. That's your infantry, your beasts, or your swarm. So you can't any longer put a tank behind a wall and expect that tank to gain cover from it. It won't work. If it's defined as an obstacle, it's only going to give cover to your infantry. So that's a key change. Another one I would say is we need a bit of clarification. Now this might seem common sense to me and you, but we need a bit of clarification around what in the way means. So again, now we haven't seen the official sort of rules excerpt, but Games Workshop have just given us the narrative around what obstacles mean. But if I could draw your attention to sort of this example here, we have an obstacle that is in the way of these two forces. We've got an Imperial Guard infantry squad on one side, and we've got some Space Marines on the other side. Now, this obstacle is technically in the way. No one is holding the Aegis defense line. No one is up there actually holding it. But it is technically in the way. So does that mean that these guardsmen would get cover from these Space Marine bikes shooting at them? Does it mean that the lieutenant would get cover from the guardsmen? We can also see that these bikers, they're not going to benefit from it from cover, because even though they are a similar size to the guardsmen, I mean, if you really get down to it, if I just borrow this little chappy here and put it here, he really isn't, in terms of height, he really isn't that much different from the Space Marine. But again, that Space Marine biker is not going to benefit from the obstacle terrain. So maybe bikers will get cover from it. We don't know. But you can see how no one is actually manning this barricade. Now, Aegis defense lines, I will acknowledge, may get their own special rules in the Games Workshop categories. Totally understand that. So just imagine this is a generic obstacle. It could be a row of crates, could be just a bit of wall. Just imagine it's a generic obstacle which has been given the sort of the light cover terrain trait. So you can see straight away how we do need a bit of clarification around obstacles. What is in the way? See, traditionally, if I was to say, what unit's going to get cover and what unit isn't, I would draw you to this example where you've got the Space Marine Scouts versus the Ogryns. Now, those Space Marine Scouts are clearly manning that barricade. I would expect them to get cover from the Ripper guns of the Ogryns. However, the Ogryns, that barricade is technically in the way. It is in between the Scouts and the Ogryns. So does that mean that cover also flows back towards the Ogryns? So you can understand how, I know it seems I'm being a bit rules as written, and I am being a bit pedantic. To me and you, when we're playing on like a basement battle report, I would obviously say, look, the Scouts have got cover there, the Ogryns don't. The Scouts are manning the barricade. But, that's me playing rules as intended. And there is that clear difference where you want to play rules intended versus rules as written. And again, referring to the tournament scene and competitiveness, a thing which Games Workshop seems to be embracing more and more, technically rules as written will always apply. So in this case, you know, do these Ogrins also get cover? Because, you know, what is in the way? How is it defined? I think that just needs a bit of clarification. I think how I would define it is that you get cover from the obstacle if the models in the unit are within 1 inch of the terrain feature. So, for example, in this case, those scouts are within 1 inch of the terrain feature, so the obstacle would give them soft cover. And the Ogrins are not within 1 inch, so they would not benefit from it. And in this example, no one is within 1 inch of the obstacle. No one's manning the barricades, as it were, so no one would gain cover. I suspect that will be in the rulebook, but from what we've seen in the preview, that is not clear. So that's just one to be aware of, guys, and it's one that we need some extra clarification on. So that's all the terrain categories that Games Workshop have previewed. Now let's take a look at the terrain traits that they've shown us. So there's 3: light cover, heavy cover, and obscuring. Now light cover is the one that we know and love. It's from 8th edition. You know, if you're in cover, light cover specifically, add 1 to saving throw made against ranged attacks. Great. Heavy cover is a bit more convoluted, and I've seen a lot of confusion around this terrain trait, and to be honest, I'm still pretty confused about it. So the exact wording is as follows. Heavy cover: when an attack made with a melee weapon wounds a model that is receiving the benefits of cover from this terrain feature, add 1 to the saving throw made against that attack, unless the model making the attack made a charge move this turn. Now, the confusing bit for that is regarding the charge move this turn. So, as it currently stands, there are some people that are arguing that if you make the if you charge an enemy unit, that enemy unit will not get the heavy cover for the turn that you charge against them. So if we come over here and I try and use this as an example, we've got a unit of 3 Bulgrin here. They make the charge into these Space Marines. Now let's say that we've defined this bunker as heavy cover. It's, you know, it's not a ruin, it's a pretty well intact structure. Now, does the heavy cover rule mean that you get cover? Now the Ogrin is inside the cover, right? And he's fighting the Marines. Oh, sorry about that. He's in the cover and he's fighting the Marines, okay? Does it mean that because he charged, and he is the charging model, and he is making the attack, that those Marines would not benefit from heavy cover? And that, in fact, it wouldn't be until next turn when no one is charging that both sides would gain heavy cover? And in fact, would it mean that because the Bulgrin charged, they don't get heavy cover, but they didn't charge, so he gets heavy cover? So charging into a terrain piece is actually beneficial to the charging model? That seems really backwards and doesn't make sense. In fact, what I think it means is that if you are the charging model and you make it into that terrain piece, then these guys will get cover from the heavy cover. They're defending it. But you won't. You won't get it because the turn you charge, you're not sort of holding this bit of heavy cover. That's what I think it's meant to say, because otherwise heavy cover really benefits the attacker and not the defender. And that doesn't really make sense. If you're holding a particularly defensible heavy piece of terrain, there's no way that it's going to be beneficial to your opponent who's charging you. That would be very silly. So again, we need some clarification around that. I personally think it means that the charger does not gain cover, and these guys do. But right now, it is being very much argued on internet forums and whatnot which way it falls, and most people seem to be falling on the side of it benefits the attacker, which is mad to me, but we'll see. Now, the last terrain trait that I want to talk about today is the obscuring trait. Now, obscuring has definitely caused a lot of excitement and chatter around the water cooler, as it were, because it has a lot of implications. So I'll read the rule word for word and then we'll go through some examples of it. If this terrain feature is at least 5 inches in height, then models cannot see through or over this terrain feature. This means that one model is not visible to another if you cannot draw a straight line 1mm in thickness between them without it passing through or over any part of this terrain feature. The height of the terrain feature is measured from the highest point on that terrain feature. Models that are on or within this terrain feature can be seen and targeted normally. Aircraft models and models with wound characteristic of 18 or more are visible and can be targeted even if this terrain feature is in between it and the firing model. Note the reverse is not true. So, what does that mean? It essentially means if you are a flyer, then obscuring terrain will never benefit you. And if you are a knight or another super heavy, like a Baneblade, then the obscuring terrain is never going to benefit you. So just on a quick edit there, guys, we went to grab that Baneblade. Now let's say that this piece of terrain in the middle of the board is obscuring. Pretty typical, it's a nice bit of loz blocking terrain in the middle of the table. How that would work is this unit of Marines could not be targeted by anybody on this side because this is an obscuring bit of terrain, it's over 5 inches. So this commander and this Baneblade could not shoot these Marines. Likewise, these Marines could not shoot this officer. However, these Marines can shoot this Baneblade because it has got more than 18 wounds. So do you see how that works? So big things that are on one side of the obscuring terrain can be shot, but the big thing cannot shoot through the obscuring terrain. Now, however, if these Marines were to step 1 foot into that terrain, let's say there's an objective on the other side they need to get through, the moment they do that, the obscuring terrain sort of goes away and the Baneblade would be able to then target those Marines. So in principle, it makes good sense. It's basically building on the sort of ITC rules of you can't see through the bottom level of ruins. Makes sense? All good. Or is it? It starts getting a little silly because Games Workshop have said you can't see through or over the terrain piece, which implies that this terrain piece has infinite height. I can't see over the top of it. So that starts getting a little silly because if we look at this as an example, we've got a unit of Marines here armed with a heavy bolter. They've got a 36-inch range, commanding view of the battlefield on top of this citadel. You then also have a squad of guardsmen. They've also got a heavy bolter, same range and same height on their terrain piece. They've got a commanding view of the battlefield. However, neither side can see each other, because this is an obscuring piece of terrain. I mean, if we get down there, they obviously can see each other. No issues, they can see each other. But according to the terrain rules, neither side can see over this piece of terrain, even though it is actually a full level lower than the buildings they currently occupy. So that doesn't make sense. That's very, very unusual. It's almost like this warehouse filled with crates is infinitely high, and so that starts breaking the immersion a little bit, doesn't it? Now, I know some of you will be saying, well, you know, you would just agree with your opponent that this wasn't obscuring, and you would, if you were playing sort of house rules, you could say, well, obviously they can see each other, so they can see each other. All well and good when you're playing at home, guys, all well and good. But again, I have to refer to you to the tournament scene and the rules as written situation, because tournaments are becoming more and more popular. ITC is having more and more of an effect on the base game. And so what we would be doing if we were playing a tournament, and this was a tournament board, and it is, you know, it's not far off. I mean, there isn't any L shapes in the middle, but imagine this was L shapes instead. You would have the situation where neither side would be able to shoot each other across this bit of terrain. If they can clearly see each other, but they can't shoot each other. So it's just a bit unusual, and you would have to play it that way because that was what would be defined in the tournament mission pack, in the rules as written. You can't house rule a tournament, you have to play the rules as written. It also comes to an interesting point. If we have infinite terrain here, what about those obstacles we talked about before? Now, I am going off a bit down a rabbit hole here, guys, so bear with me. You know, and I appreciate it seems a bit silly, but if this has an infinite height, again, we're going to need that definition of in the way when it comes to obstacles, because this obstacle is in between the unit that's occupying this building and the unit which is occupying this building. Does that therefore mean that if, let's say, these buildings have not been given any terrain traits, because, you know, they're basically open gantries, you know, there's nowhere you can really hide on here, there's no walls or anything. So these terrain features are essentially hills. Does that mean that this unit would get the benefit of cover because of this barricade? Because it's in the way. It's in between the two squads occupying these buildings. You know, it's opened up a bit of a can of worms. And we do need some clarification around it. Now, if I am to take a step back and be a little less rules lawyerish and a bit more sensible, how would I play this? Well, I would obviously say, you know, that barricade doesn't benefit them. This terrain feature is just to help you get a bit of line of sight. This terrain obviously benefits the scouts and not the Ogryns. You know, the Bullgryns that are attacking the bunker, obviously the Marines defending that bit of heavy cover are going to get the benefit. And these guys, even though this is obscuring, these guys can clearly see over the top of each other in an elevated position, so no problems. But I've had to interpret that myself, and I'm playing that based on just, you know, what could potentially be a wrong interpretation of the rules. And so we do need some clarification around these terrain rules. And so so that's the good, you know, the bad and the ugly when it comes to the obscuring rule. What are my overall thoughts on the terrain rules? I think if we apply a modicum of common sense, they're actually really good and they add a level of depth to the terrain. I do think, however, that we've started to stray back into old Games Workshop territory when rules were convoluted and open to massive interpretation. One of the benefits of 8th edition, I know 8th is going away, you know, long live, the 8th is dead, long live 8th, but one of the benefits of 8th edition was that, yes, there was still some misinterpretation of the rules, but the rules were simple enough that when an interpretation was unsure, Games Workshop could errata it fairly easily, fairly quickly, and then everyone knew the right way to play. They've gone back to adding in, I would say, probably a little bit too much depth to the 40k rules, which I know is crazy because I love a complicated game. You know, I love playing, you know, Bolt Action has got much more in-depth rules than 40k does. But one of the things, the problem with 40k is that it seems to suffer more from convolution than, let's say, for example, Bolt Action. It seems to be that the rules are a bit more abstract and require a bit more interpretation on the part of the player than they do in Bolt Action. To be honest, guys, they're just a little... 40k rules, when they start getting complicated, very quickly start getting unclear. And we've seen that already. Now, I will caveat this video, and I will play devil's advocate for a second. We haven't seen the full rules book. We don't know how all these things will play into each other. We don't know, we haven't seen everything. It's as simple as that. It could be very simply that Games Workshop say, you know, true line of sight still plays a part. Obscuring is, it means that if the model is over the top, like the knight can't use that bit to draw line of sight over. That might be the way it's meant to be. Totally get it in that case. Because that would mean that these two units can see each other, no worries, but it means the knight, which might stand above the terrain piece with like one of its shoulders, can't fire all its guns from its shoulder over the top. In that case, makes total sense, totally get it, and I totally understand the way the obscuring rule's meant to work. But we just need that level of clarification. So how I would end this video, how I'm going to end this video is, the terrain rules overall look good. They've added a necessary level of depth. I just think that we need a bit of clarification from Games Workshop, and I suspect that clarification will come when we get the full 9th edition rules set. Let me know what you guys think about the terrain rules. You know, do you like the soft cover? How do you interpret the heavy cover rule? And what are your thoughts on the obscuring rule? Do and how do you think it should be interpreted? Thank you for watching. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. I hope it has clarified some of the points that Games Workshop have done. And I will see you guys next time.